topic is forensic audit second review. And so let's go ahead and, Stephen, could you start us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is roll call. Madam Clerk?
So I'll be taking roll for this special meeting.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Calhoun? Here. Casagrande?
Here.
Wells?
Here.
DeMoss?
Here.
McClure?
Here.
Osenga? Here. And Mayor Terry?
Yes.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is citizen comments on any subject except those items scheduled for public hearing. During our special meeting, we have no public hearing items. Those who have signed in will be given the first opportunity to speak. Time is limited to 3 minutes per speaker. And just state if you live inside or outside city limits for the record. Has anyone signed in?
Nobody on the sign-in sheet.
Okay, so anyone can get up and speak during this time. When we go into committee of the whole, we'll also have opportunity for public comments at that time, but you're welcome to speak right now if you would like to take the time to do that. Okay, hearing and seeing none. Next on the agenda is the approval of the agenda and consent agenda. If I can get a motion and a second, please.
I move for the approval of the agenda and the consent agenda.
I'll second. Are there any changes, amendments? I think we're ready for a vote.
Okay, voting on the agenda and consent agenda. Osenga?
Yes.
Calhoun?
Yes.
Wells?
Yes.
Casagrande?
Yes.
DeMoss?
Yes.
McClure?
Yes.
Mayor Terry?
Yes.
No, I don't.
Okay, that agenda and consent agenda is approved, and there are no consent agenda items.
Thank you. So next is new business. I'm going to make a motion that the council moves into the committee of the whole with the topic of forensic audit second review, and I'll need a second.
I'll second.
Okay, so prior to us voting on this, I just want to outline the setup, the way I see it, and I think it's up to discussion with the whole body, but we'll have the presentation first. Then we'll come to council for questions and comments. Then we'll go to the public for questions and comments. I think we're gonna, I think we can be flexible with the time, but we'll make sure everyone gets heard, and then if people need to have a second go around, and then we'll bring it back to council. Does that sound acceptable? Mm-hmm. Okay, so if we could get a vote on going into the committee of the whole, please.
Okay, voting on the committee of the whole. Osenga?
Yes.
Calhoun?
Yes.
McClure?
Yes.
Casagrande?
Yes.
DeMoss?
Yes.
Wells?
Yes.
And Mayor Terry?
Yes.
Okay, you are now in a committee of the whole.
Great, thank you. So I think we will welcome our presenters. And I don't know what, looks like the clerk's getting the PowerPoint on. I think we had some hard copy PowerPoints for the public. And then if you guys want to kick it off, it's for you. It would be helpful if you come up to the podium with the mic, or if you need to sit down, we can set something else up. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is James Edmonstone, and I'm accompanied by James Squardo, who from Green Forensics in Chicago. And if I'm limping, it's because I twisted my knee this morning.
Oh, no.
Answering the call from the city. And thank you for having us back. I'm sorry I couldn't be here this first time, but we all had COVID, and the doctor told us not to travel.
Yeah.
With good reason, I might add. So we were asked to go through an overview of what we talked about last time, and possibly a little bit higher level. So my slides this time are considerably less detailed than before. And if we can go to slide 3. I'm just going to walk through each of the major issues that we see, and talk about them at a high level, and then you can ask questions.
Right.
So the first one I want to talk about is classification, and that goes back to how the city defines through its various ordinances and documents and tariffs, different things pertaining to the tariff. And I want to call out residential as a very, very good one. So different parts of the tariff, and for example, you have a water sewer tariff, you have the electrical tariff, which we looked at, and they treat the definition of residence a different way. And it becomes confusing from our standpoint, looking at what a customer might think, because they may not know how they stand with the city on the different tariffs. For example, on the water sewer tariff, they may be considered residential, while on the utility electric tariff, they may be considered to be more of a commercial enterprise. And what we've recommended on this, going across the board, is that the city adopt one definition for each classification. So if you're residential for water sewer, you're residential for electrical, and you would be a residential for other tariffs that you might be considering, or other ordinances, and that folks have one place to look. In our original report, we put together a comparison of how the definitions flow within the tariff, but then we also put together a comparison of how certain definitions flowed from from ordinance, say, to tariff, and how they're treated across the board, so it would make it easier to understand how we were addressing this and what our recommendations were. I'm going to go into a couple of examples, one of which I talked to a couple of folks about today. For example, in the electrical area and in the water sewer area, the water sewer tariff with respect to somebody's laundry. So the tariff allows laundry either inside somebody's residence, say if there's an apartment, or they could have a common laundry for the whole area, but that's still considered to be residential. But if you look at the electrical tariff for the same type of facility, that's considered to be commercial. And so there's a disconnect right there. You could look at other examples too, but I thought that was a good one to start with. And then there were some questions brought up earlier about home-based businesses. And we felt the definition of home-based businesses was a little bit confusing, but also how they're treated. So they could be treated one way for residential, one way for commercial. One of the things, one of our recommendations, which I'll go through again at the end, was that the city consider separating the billing systems for electrical versus water sewer, because really they're based on different things. So the electrical billing is based upon usage, but the water sewer billing is based more on classifications or characteristics of the user. And if you look in the water sewer tariff, you'll see pages defining what the different classes are and how they fit. So if you're a laundromat, you may be in one classification, but if you're a church, you may be a different classification. Whereas the electrical department is more interested in just how much power are you using, and are you going over the threshold to be a demand user. And another thing we felt that you should do is take the classifications and make them a little more user-friendly. So we put an example in there of having the classifications by type of user, because right now it's basically by classification, and then you go down the different classifications and try to figure out which one am I, versus the chart we put together said, well, I'm a bakery, so that would make me a group B and under this set of ERUs. And we'll come back to that some more, but that's an overview of the classification. Go to the next slide, please. Equivalent residential units. The city bills for water and sewer based on meters or equivalent residential units. And the bottom line is we feel that the ERU system is broken. And it's most likely not cost effective to repair. So, first of all, we found that in going through the ERUs, there's no database supporting ERU numbers. Now, this is going to be more for commercial and larger businesses than, say, a residence. But if there's 2 ERUs in the database, there's no other database that says the 2 ERUs represent 2 chairs and 14 tables, if you would go down the criteria, for example. So, and there never has been. The ERUs also, they're not maintained. So at some point in the past, an enterprise was assigned an ERU number, but the city doesn't go through and update that number. We ran across a case recently where there were ERUs assigned in the early 90s. Well, this was a commercial enterprise, and over that time, the use of the facility had completely changed. But unless the customer would come to the city and say, hey, the use has changed, I want you to relook at it, it continues the way it was before. And then as we went and interviewed in September a number of customers, and a lot of them didn't understand what the ERUs were. So we went in and we were comparing the city's database. So if the city said they had 5 ERUs, we went in, looked at the criteria for a particular establishment, and counted the criteria to see if we could come up to it. I think we did twice. We matched out of 25 or so, 25. And when we walked in, it took quite a while to explain to the customer why we were there, because a lot of them didn't understand the whole ERU concept. And it was pertaining to, if it was a restaurant, the number of chairs they had and the number of bathrooms and things like that. Another thing is, we didn't feel that the ERUs were adjustable like a meter. If you're on a meter, and when the pandemic hit and everybody was shut down, those customers basically used less water. The customers that were on ERUs, they continued to be billed for their ERU usage, even though their establishment was either closed, or the restaurant might have gone to takeout. Or they may have taken half their chairs and blocked them off so people couldn't use them. But there was no adjustment for that. And then another thing we did is we said, okay, well, an ERU is defined as something, a normal amount or a reasonable amount of water, but that's not a number. So we went back and said, are the ERUs, are they reflective of actual water consumption? And so we did some testing in that area, and one of the things we did is we went back to some of the establishments that are already being metered, and we retroactively calculated what their ERUs would be if they'd been on ERUs. And we found in every case the meter was a better fit for them by a fair, substantial amount of money, which showed us that the ERUs were not matching that. Then we looked at the school system, which we laid out in our report, and we looked at the high school versus the other schools, and it was a considerable difference in the monthly billing rate. Now, granted, the high school has a pool and the rest of the schools don't, but then we got into a discussion with some of the school officials about the use of the cafeteria, because the way the current ERU system is set up, they're billed separately for, or you add to that the cafeteria, but the school felt they weren't really using the cafeteria, and so they may be being billed for ERUs that they really were not using at all. And then in some of the discussions we've had more recently, we learned too that the school over the years has changed its use, because at one time apparently it was a much larger building and had a different use than it has today, but there again the ERUs have not been adjusted for its current use. So for us, the school would be a great example that should be switched to meters. Now, the other thing is, who was looking at this to say, gee, I'm having a big bill for my high school, but I'm not getting a big bill for my other schools. And apparently the city never received any feedback, and nor did it offer any feedback to its customers saying it was different. Another example is we compared 2 like businesses. And one was on meters and one was on ERUs. And the business that was on meter was considerably less, but then there's a caveat, because in the process of doing this comparison, we discovered that that particular business, their meter had failed years ago, and they were put on a flat rate, and the flat rate was never adjusted. And there was no penalty, I guess you could put it, or incentive for the business to correct this. So that business was paying considerably less for their water than a like business. I think I had one more, I'll come back to it. I had one more thought, but it ran away temporarily. So we'll come back to it. Let's move on to power factor, the next slide. Power factor is, it shows the efficiency of power being used, and it's been in your tariffs for years. It's in there every year, but it's never been actually measured or charged. There was work done on that by former utility managers maybe 10 years ago, and we looked at some spreadsheets where they had calculated it, but we also went back and looked at the meter readings that were in those spreadsheets, and we couldn't match those to the actual meter readings of the impacted businesses. But you've got maybe 10, 20 or more businesses that could be charged a power factor if they had the correct metering in place. And what's happening is that it's a somewhat of a small drain on your system, because I think, Rob, you said they're delivering more power than is showing up on the meter because of inefficient use, and it's correctable. And it's our opinion that if you're going to have it in the tariff, you should be billing those people, and those people should be told who their businesses. They should be told who they are and encouraged to correct it, because the whole idea of billing a power factor is that you have the business, you encourage them to correct and make more efficient use of their power. We also looked at the power factor. You're being charged a power factor by the utility, but your power factor is nowhere near the point that you would be in a penalty or a deficit situation, because you're paying power factor and not recovering it, so you're not there. But there could, if you had a lot of businesses and you didn't address this at some point in time, you might come up into that situation. Let's go to the next slide. Let's see if okay, cost of power adjustment. The cost of power adjustment is the city's process of recovering the amount it's paying to the electric utility for the power it's buying wholesale. So the intent is, if you had $100 coming in a month that you had paid, that you got, then the next month you would recover that from all of your customers, so you're whole. And then the rest of the cost would in theory be the cost that's costing the city to run, to administer and maintain the infrastructure and things of that nature. There is no formal process, or there is no formal general ledger account where you actually monitor how much you're recovering. It's done right now rather informally on a rather complicated spreadsheet. What makes it complicated is it's just not that you get the pure charges from the utility, you get adjustments, because the utility gets adjustments also. So there's adjustments for the Bradley Lake, they have adjustments for their own cost of power. They have adjustments because things happen within the utility, and there's checks. And so some of these adjustments are rather significant. And the tariff allows the city to recover that immediately or to spread it out. But when you start spreading out the recoveries, it gets really complicated. And then right now, the spreadsheet that is analyzing the cost of power adjustment is also analyzing the cost to maintain the emergency standby generator system. And what we talked about recently was that those two should be separately calculated. And then also you should have a general ledger account, so you can look at that in your budget and say, okay, I have $10,000 in there, and that is what I'm expecting to see. That would be 1 month's worth of power that I haven't allocated to the customers yet. Right now, it takes a rather complicated system to see it, and then there's the ability to move things and adjust it, and you may be in a deficit situation and not actually realize it. It also gets very, very time consuming and complicated. The other thing we talked about that wasn't in our report, but it's come up in some discussion since, is that you may want to consider setting up a reserve account for your emergency standby generation for the fuel cost, because fuel is so expensive, and you burn it, if you ran into a situation where you were down and needed emergency power for several days, it could become very, very expensive. And rather than trying to bill all that to the customers after the fact, you might want to set a little kitty up of funds so you're covered for a day or two if you have to run it up front. It's easier for the customers. Sort of like you'd have a reserve account in an HOA. So you know you have to repair something, you're ready and go ahead and repair it. Demand charges. Large customers are subject to demand charges. One of the discrepancies we had, and we actually talked about, was with the residential customers, whether a residential customer, because they would appear to be exempt from demand charges, the way the tariff is put together, even if they're operating a small business, and that business comes within the two exceptions for being a commercial business. The demand charges are measured off of demand meters. One of the items of confusion we found is that some customers felt that because they had a demand meter, they were going to be billed demand. But demand happens, you get billed demand when you meet the thresholds of the tariff, which is for running 3 months where you've gone over it. Then we looked at, well, we said, Chugach, they bill demand to the city, but the city is allocating that demand in the cost of power adjustment. Should they be allocating that demand to only the demand charges? So we went back to Rob Montgomery, and he went back to the utility, and they responded, and we added their response to our report, which basically said what you're doing now is a standard for the industry. And allocating the city's demand charge to all the customers was the proper way to do it. But we wanted to go ahead and document that. I was also asked to say a few words about smart metering. And I know it's something you're considering. And smart metering, among other things, it allows you to adjust your metering and encourage people to be more efficient with the use of power. Now, I work for a utility in Florida, and we had smart metering. Of course, you would have a different situation, but down there it was run your pool at night and clean your pool at night. Don't clean it when we're max producing power. California has the same situation. In Florida, we were having to run jet engines just to meet the real jet engines from jet aircraft that we had put on blocks just to meet the demand for the day. Smart metering has a lot of advantages, and we encourage you to look into it. It also allows you to make changes without having to get involved in switching out hardware. You can basically sit there, and also allows you to do some more administrative functions remotely. The next slide, please. Jim, I think I've covered everything. Okay, so Jim's going to talk about the actual analysis of the 4 months.
Once again, I'm Jim Scordo from Green Forensic Accounting. So when we first brought in, we were told we were going to look at all these invoices, and we found that the city actually doesn't maintain copies of all the invoices, and it was determined that the billed statistics data file would be the best place for us to capture that data, analyze that data, because it's that data that actually is pulled into all of the invoices. So then we took that and we compared it to the tariffs. So we went through each billing code and said, okay, here's the billed statistics for each billing code. We looked at the tariff and compared the two. And we found that there were a number of unknown rates that were used and billed. And since our report was issued, the city's gone through and done took a look at it and determined that some of them had very reasonable explanations, right? Some of those rates were prorated, so it wasn't a full month, and it wasn't obvious from the billed statistic data file that it was a partial month, but that's an example of some that came up as being okay in the end. When it comes to prior period rates, again, those were initially identified us as, well, we don't know what this rate is. And then, we had the utility department go through, and when they reviewed it, said, oh, well, that was a 2017 rate that ended up still remaining in 2018, 2019. So again, and it was an unknown rate to us because we were comparing it to the 2018, 2019 tariffs, which was, during our examination period. But it ends up being, okay, well, now we know it's a 2017 rate. It was just charged inappropriately. That rate in the system had not been updated. So our recommendation there is that, there should be something in the standard operating procedures. Every time a new tariff period goes into effect, there should be some sort of checklist that you go through and say, okay, we've changed this rate. It sounds simple, but obviously, at least in some instances, a couple, it didn't happen and, created this, somewhat confusion on our end, saying we don't know what this rate is. Tariff rates charged under an incorrect billing code. So this could be as simple as a small business service charge being billed under a large business code. So it could be it's just a matter of coding in some instances. So our recommendation there is that the rates be restricted in the system. You should be able to restrict, this is a small general service billing code, a small general service billing rate. It should only be able to be used under a small general service billing code. So currently that's not the case. So there's the capability right now, you go in, you say this is a large general service, but somehow the small general service code is selected. So you can put restrictions in place in the systems to restrict the use of rates to only the billing codes that they apply to. So that should eliminate that, and it's good control to have in place. I know since our report, some of those errors have already been corrected, and I think there's in the next billing cycle, some additional corrections are going to be made. One of the issues similar or along this line is there's a difference between the ERUs, right? So currently there's a tariff, the tariff has an ERU rate, but then there's also some flat customer charges but they're the same, right? They're the same dollar amount. So one of our other recommendations as long as ERUs are being utilized, that any of the flat customer charge rates are not the exact same dollar amount as an ERU, because I think that causes some confusion where you see that dollar amount, you don't know if you're being charged a flat rate or if you're being charged for one ERU, and that was also, I think, a source of some confusion there. And then the rates that were, there's some rates that have been established that aren't listed in the tariff. So a good example are some of the street lights or different yard lights, whatever they are, different wattages. The tariff has some rates in there, but then when a customer comes across or inspector comes across a different wattage than what's in the tariff, they've sort of established some rates and used them in practice over time, over multiple years, but those rates have never been defined and included in the tariff, and it's something that we think we would recommend if there is a practice of, here's a service type, and we're gonna use this rate, it should be included in the tariff. And our recommendation there also is, if there's a rate that's gonna be used that's not in the tariff, that there should be a standard operating procedure that says, for whatever reason, we're using this rate, it's not in the tariff, and then there should be certain questions contemplated there. Should the tariff be updated to include this rate for this service? If it's not in the tariff, why is it not in the tariff? Should it be updated now? Should it be updated in the following year? And then some documentation of, why that rate's being used. Any questions on that part?
I have a few questions, but maybe we can wait till the end.
Yeah, I
So-
can keep track of mine.
Yeah, I'm writing it down.
I'm going to expand a little bit on some of our recommendations. As I mentioned earlier, standardizing the definitions across all the tariffs and ordinances. So a resident or a customer will not be confused by looking at one ordinance and it has one definition, another ordinance that has a different definition. I wanted to give you another example I was thinking about a while ago. If I recall, in some of your tariffs, they talked about owner occupied, but then later I looked at a different ordinance and it talked about the definition of an owner. And the definition of an owner was very broad. It could be your attorney, your friend, and in theory, you may have intended that the owner lived in the establishment, but the way I read the tariff now, you could basically have several owners of the same, related to the same thing, and each one could be designated an owner for purposes of a particular building. It's somewhat confusing, and I would recommend changing some of those. I'm going to come back to that in a minute with the ERUs. I just want to move down. The electrical invoicing, we've talked to a number of people in the city about this. We think you should separate physically the electrical invoicing from the rest of the invoicing because the characteristics of electrical charges are just different. They're universal, but it's a different type of system than, say, you would be charging for water, sewer, or trash, or something else. And it leads to a bit of confusion if you're going to have electrical being charged on usage, which is basically, with the one caveat on electrical, that's how it works, but on others it may be different, and also your electrical system has more graduated rates in it than the others do. And one of the things that struck me also with the electrical invoicing, I think it was the demand meter policy. It said the intended use of power. That leads me to another recommendation, is in several of the ordinances and tariffs we saw, they had loose criteria, in my personal opinion, that was hard to enforce. It's hard to determine what somebody's intended use was. I would make it more concrete. I recall another tariff that talked about, or another point, it was given an example of how their tax status was, whether they were being in business and filing a certain type of tax return. But that's almost impossible to enforce because you're not going to go look to see whether or not they are filing that return. It would be I don't think you have an income tax in the state. So you couldn't go to the state and say, show me how this person reported this income. So I would make your definitions less complicated, I would streamline it, and I would make it more focused to things you can actually control and enforce. We're recommending that ERU should be phased out in favor of meters. What we saw was a broken system where it's not being enforced, the databases don't have any base to them, and to bring it and enforce it is very complicated. It's also very expensive. So I was likening it earlier today to a situation where you go your property taxes, and you have a property tax assessor, and every 3 years, the assessor goes through and they look at your property and they compare it to other properties, and they said, now your property is worth $10, last year it was worth $8. And then you go fight with the assessor and you come to an agreement, and then your taxes are based off of that. If you're going to have an ERU database, you really have to do sort of the same thing. You've got to go in on a periodic basis, either through a third party or yourself, and go in and count the criteria of the database to make it legitimate. And because right now, you're relying on a customer coming to you saying, my database is wrong, but we found that most customers don't even understand how their bill is being calculated, so they wouldn't be able to come tell you. Another problem with ERUs is they're not always realistic with respect to usage. So taking a barber shop or beauty salon or someplace like that, you bill by the number of chairs. But that doesn't mean you have the number of employees that are actually staffing those chairs, or you have the customer base that's coming in to support the use of all those chairs. And you literally have to have somebody come in and remove them from the floor. It's not like a restaurant. You know, those chairs are built into the floor. Then we found other places, for example, a church is a good example. So part of the ERU database is you go in, and if they have an eating facility and they get together, then they get a restaurant charge for the number of chairs and things like that. But from a practical standpoint, how often are they actually using it? In the last 2 years, they probably haven't used it at all. And in real times, they might use it once or twice a month. I think we went to the social center, it was the same thing. They have a kitchen, they have the tables and the chairs, and they're not being billed for it. Now, in a couple of cases, we felt that the city had seen that it was inequitable, and they had sort of made some adjustments themselves. But you don't want people to be doing that. You want adjustments through a formalized process. And so we talked about the possibility of some examples is for residents going to a flat charge as you try to phase, if you would decide to phase it out, and then focusing first on your commercial enterprises and getting them on meters. Because meters are really going to have a lot fewer headaches in the long term. But it's somewhat expensive and involved process to move everything over. And then if you have people who have a broken meter, you need to have some sort of charge in your system that you encourage them for compliance. The IRS is really good at that. And, but we did feel that the ERU system as a whole probably is not cost effective for you. System of checks and balances. So one of the things we noticed is you have somebody doing, this point here and my last point are somewhat similar. So if you have a person, you need procedures so the person that makes the entries into the system isn't the same one that takes the money. You need a system that when a person goes in and makes an entry or an input into the system and say change somebody's rates, that there's an approval process. Now depending upon what the nature of the adjustment is would depend upon the level of improvement. If somebody was changing a customer's, say, rate, you might want somebody to have to sign in and verify that on the spot before it went into effect. You'd also want logs printed out, and you'd want a manager to review the system changes. So if there's anything that is questionable, it's identified, say, within a week or two. And while it's all fresh in everyone's mind, you can say, okay, I made this change because this was wrong. I made this adjustment for this reason. And a manager level would look at that and say, yes, I approve of it. Physically sign something either through the system or a piece of paper and say, okay, I've approved these changes. And then you track them. Power factors, we talked about, power factor should be charged. If you have it in your tariff, you should be charging it. It's confusing to have something in the tariff and not charging it, because then the customers who are not paying it think they're never going to be held responsible for it. And then when you try to implement it, it's going to become painful, because they're going to say, well, you've had it in the tariff for 20 years, I've never been billed for it. So one of the recommendations we made is an education process starting now, talking to those customers and explaining to them how it's going to work, and then giving them a target date that you're planning to start charging it. And encouraging them Because the whole point of charging the power factor is to get them to change the behavior so they don't have a power factor charge. Cost of power adjustment. So one of the things we talked about today was setting a cost of power adjustment on an annual basis and then truing it up the next year, rather than trying to do all of these adjustments, because the adjustments are running through from the utility every month or two, and some of them can be they can be high, and from your standpoint, they may come at the wrong time of the year when you have a lower customer base. So if you set a cost if you looked at the last year or two and you said, okay, this is how much my power is, and this is the amount I'm going to charge every month to my customer, allocating it the way you've been doing it. And then at the end of the year, you calculate what your cost of power adjustment's going to be for the next year based on 12 months of historical charges. Because what we've noticed is that some of these larger adjustments are being postponed, or they're being allocated over time, and then it makes it very, very difficult. If somebody came back and said, I want to know how you did for last year, it's a very complicated process. But if you had one charge every month for a year, and then at the end of the year, you do a true-up and you calculate it all out, then the next year, you're going to have one charge every month for a year. It's a lot easier to explain to people. And then when you get these large adjustments that come in sometime in the mid-year, you're not scrambling trying to figure out how you're going to deal with it, especially if it happens at a time of the year where you really don't feel you want to allocate that to the existing customers. We also recommended that they take the charges related to the emergency generation system and they separate those, segregate that and have a separate allocation for that. And then, as we already talked about, we recommended you should consider setting up a reserve for that. So in the event or when the power goes out someday, you'll be set up and you won't have cash crunch trying to buy fuel when it's $7 or $8 a gallon for diesel. One of the things we found when we were going through the process of the audit is that the audit required us to look at the invoices, but you don't keep copies of the invoices. So we wound up having to do bill statistics and then comparing different things and building spreadsheets and doing allocations, which Jim's really good at. So we recommend you keep an electronic file in some format of the invoices. Now, Jeremy has the ability right now to pull together an invoice for a particular purpose, but to pull together the thousands of invoices we were looking at, it wasn't very effective and it was very time consuming. And then we talked about before the input logs and having a system of controls, checks and balances, which we didn't see. So if there's any questions, you can make sure that people take their vacations. It's one of the things we see in this is you have a person in a position, and if they never go on vacation, that's a red flag, because that could mean that they're trying to cover something. And you also want to have a segregation of duties, so the individuals that are handling the cash have nothing to do with the rest of the system. And the individuals reconciling the bank statements don't handle the cash. And you have a count of all the bank accounts. One of the areas that we see fraud in, that happened in Dixon, where there was a bank account, but it was a zero balance, because the individual involved was taking the money, running it through the account, but zeroing it at the end of the year. So the auditors looked at it and said, well, it's a zero account, it doesn't mean anything, but in fact, she had put millions of dollars to it. That's the end of our presentation, so I guess we're ready for questions.
Yeah, well, I'll just start it up and say, building on the last presentation that you made with all the data,
Yeah.
and now having the higher level on the recommendations is very helpful. So I just want to say kind of everything wrapped it up. And, I guess from my point of view, why I thought this audit was important was I don't want us to be a utility where it's like customers at your own risk. Like, I feel like whatever we do as a city running our utilities, that we need to be Lady Justice with the blindfolds with even scales, and people in our utility can have full faith and confidence that they're getting fairly billed, both in the positive and the negative. Like, we want everyone to just be fair. So that was helpful to have all these recommendations.
And if I could interrupt for a second, One of the things that also struck us is your tariff is complicated.
Yeah,
It's, for a small city, it's really like reading a book. And so we would recommend really just shaving it down to the bare essentials. If you go to meters, that would help out a lot.
so I have one question, and then I have a question for administration, so I might just kick it off, if that's okay. So smart meters, we've had presentations on smart metering before. So with smart metering, that would be a situation where we could go, it's read remotely with the demand also, and then that could be checked remotely and it's kept in a database
And, yeah, and then you'd also be able to do the power factor.
Correct.
with
yeah.
the smart meters, yeah. Okay.
So, and then my understanding is too with the smart meters, if you have a person that's not paying their bills and things, then you can do I believe you can do a remote disconnect.
Yeah, and thank you on that. Just to touch on the power factor, our meters today can read power factors. Our issue is we're not sure if they're reading it accurately.
Okay.
So for us to charge for the power factor, we would need to go do some testing on the meters currently. And, if they check out to be fine, we could begin charging. But we also have had conversations with Chew Gas Electric in working toward having smart meters put in here in Seward, which would elevate and take us to a whole nother level in what we could do. It would also give the customers an opportunity to be able to go on the computer themselves and look in real time at what their usage is. And they can see throughout the course of the day when their usage is spiking, when it's not spiking, and help them manage their bill better.
Excellent.
And where I am in Chicago, we're with ComEd, and they actually send the customers, it's online, it tells you how you're comparing to your neighbors. So there's a lot of real data there too. So it's, the only problem with that particular system is you have to make sure that when you set up that function, it's actually reflective of like customers, because sometimes they look at your neighbors, but they don't take into account, are your neighbors the same as you are, or do they have different, they could be a farm, for example, I live out in the country, so one of my neighbors could be a farm, well, they're gonna use a lot more energy than I do, just by the nature of their doing, of how they're structured.
Thank you. And then to administration, and we do have Jeanette on the phone, just to let council, just a reminder that she's up in Anchorage, and that's for that grant symposium. So key that she was at that today and tomorrow, but she's on the phone. But I'll turn to Stephen, since he's in person, and just say, I know these recommendations are very new to administration. Can you, and I know you've also been doing, an ongoing internal audit of kind of our current customers. This was based in 2018 and 19, and then you've been doing current customers. Do you have any idea yet, and maybe this is a question for Rob, are you guys going to review the recommendations and then come back to council with some, how you can implement, or Jeanette's? Okay, Jeanette, did you hear my question? I'm sorry.
I did hear it, yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
Okay, great. To answer your question, yes, that is the plan, to continue with the internal audit and then review it and then bring back the results to council.
Okay, and then how will that dovetail, or what will be done with the recommendations made from this audit?
So if I may, I have the recommendations in front of me, and to go through it, I absolutely agree with standardization of the definition, tariff, ordinance, and regulations. That is something that we need to address and that we will address. As far as invoicing being a separate function, I definitely want to put some more thought into it, because that is an increased cost, another position in electric, but that's something I'd like to speak with Rob about, of course, and to flesh that one out. ERUs stays in favor of meters. That is absolutely ideal. However, the expense is great for meters, and one thought today was when new houses come on, requiring them to have meters at that time. That will help, bring in meters and phase them in. As far as the checks and balances, that is something I've spoken with the Carmen Jackson team about, and they're addressing, as you know, we're working finance, and then this is on the list, and of course I will speak to them about that and moving that up and seeing what we can do. Power factor, as Rob just explained it, so that's something that's going to be worked on. And Rob and I have been talking about the COPA. What I'm used to seeing is that average of the COPA and one rate, there's the different classes, but the one rate set for the year and set by council for the year. And then at the end of the year, doing that average and coming up with the new rate for the next year that's applicable for the full year, again, adopted by council. At times, there will be, can't really call it a surplus, but there will be more of a credit to the city. And at times, there won't be. There will be a deficit, and it's the cost of doing business, but it is one rate that's really based on usage. So when you're getting your bill, you know why your increased cost. So that is something that we're still researching, though, and I know that Rob is working on that. Definitely should be maintaining electronic copies of customer invoices, without a doubt, and also documentation of any adjustments, without a doubt.
Great, thank you. That was a good rundown. I'll turn it back to council for questions.
I'll go ahead and kick it off. The first one is more so of a comment. So one of you guys in your presentation said some customers were concerned if they were given a demand meter, it meant that they were going to be charged a demand charge. That was not the concern. The concern was there was demand meters that were distributed to 100 square foot apartments, and then we somehow ran out of demand meters, and there was not enough demand meters to put on the other people that actually needed them. So that was the concern of, I have never heard of anybody that thought because they had a demand meter, they were going to be charged demand. The concern is they were, the distribution of the demand meters was mismanaged, and maybe, I don't know, it was mismanaged. How about that?
Yeah, and I can address that. When the demand meters were installed a few years back, they did run short. And part of the reason is we came back, I guess a little over a year and a half ago, and the threshold for demand changed. And when it changed, that increased the number of customers who needed demand meters installed. We did not have but a few of them left in stock, and we have since gone back and installed those meters in the different businesses.
And so with that said, for those of you that were on council or watching council at the time, we received free meters from Kodiak, and there was enough, we were told at the time. But then when we started placing demand meters on anybody that had a business license, regardless of whether it was a 100 square foot unit or a 5,000 square foot unit, then we had to spend, I think, like another $75,000 to get more meters because we didn't have enough sufficient meters. So we had to spend like $75,000 to get more demand meters.
I don't remember the number.
You weren't, yeah.
Right.
So anyways, I just wanted to clarify that, and if I may. Okay. So, a question. How many small general service accounts were being billed as large general service billed with large general service building codes? And did the building code affect the rate that the user paid, or was it just a code? And that was during your presentation.
Yeah, I would have to look for the specific number, but what I was speaking to was that the rate was a small general service rate, even though it was labeled as large general service customer billing code. So it wasn't that the rate was wrong, it was that the code used was wrong.
Can I just clarify?
Jim, was that on the electric or was that water?
I think, yeah, I think that would have been electric.
Okay.
So, just to clarify, it was pretty much like calling a cat a dog, but the cat was still a cat?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead. Unless it's a, why don't you just continue?
So, one of you during your presentation said a suggestion would be there's a flat rate that was matching the same rate as an ERU. And the reason behind that is basically what the idea of that is based on a smaller intake. You know, they're being charged at least one ERU. So that was the reasoning that I understood of why the flat rate was equivalent to a ERU unit. But what you're saying is varying those so that they're not mistaken for the same?
Correct. I mean, it makes sense that you would want them to be close, but had they been even slightly different, the misuse of one of the rates in the other billing code would have been very obvious.
Even if it was by a penny? Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
Do you know the reasoning why, or how would some rate users be left behind in rate changes? Referring to when you said there were users that were receiving 2016 and 2017 rates in 2019?
So, I'm sorry, left behind?
Well, you said that in 2019, there were users that were being charged 2016 and 2017 rates, right?
I did, yes.
Okay.
So what I've seen so far, and because the specific details that you're speaking of has been presented to the utility department, and so far what we found out is that there was some adjustments being tested in the system live, which shouldn't have been happening, but that's all I know right now. So they're looking at all of the specific accounts and exceptions that we identified, and that one specifically looks like it was, we're being told it was testing of the adjustments on the live system. So, and also to clarify, the 2016-2017 rates, so for that account, it could have been like I said in what you have received, there were debits and credits, so it could have very well been a wash in the end, but just the fact that those were there. But again, another recommendation that I had, that I didn't speak to specifically, was once a prior period, well, it's a good example actually, of how a certain billing code, such as a 2016 code, can be set up in the system not to be allowed, and it should be restricted from being used for current period charges. So that's something that can be set up in the system such that 2016-2017 rates can only apply to 2016-2017 billings.
And can you tell me how many users were receiving 2016 and 2017 rates in 2019?
Not off the top of my head.
So there were several.
I would, yeah, not off the top of my head, but I can definitely get back to you on that.
Okay. Go ahead. So, in one of your presentations, you said there were unknown rates that were used and billed, and some of them were reasonable, and we were given an example of a prorated rate, which makes sense. And there were others. Which ones did you find that appeared not to be reasonable? Like, what's an example of something that was found that was unreasonable?
I I guess it would be, I mean, it's not that they're unreasonable, but there were some errors. So I guess I would distinguish between the two. Some were unknown rates that were obvious explanations in the end. Like prorated, wrong billing code. But then there were some that were errors that need to be corrected.
Do you have any idea approximately how many unknown rates that were not, that were errors that you found?
I don't have a quantification of that off the top of my head.
Maybe we can get that later?
Sure.
Okay, and I think the rest are just comments that maybe after we talk about moving forward.
Okay. Any questions? Yeah, I'll just check with the, make sure everyone on the diocese had an opportunity before we go to the public. Councilmember DeMoss?
Yeah, I've got a question. When you said, Jim, I think you said that there was input logs that should have been reviewed that you didn't get. That was missing, some software reports from the software that was missing that you were unable to retrieve.
We talked about that, and since we, this afternoon I called the vendor to track that down in a little bit more detail. So I'll have to get back to you on that, but I did follow up.
Okay, so can you just verify that, like, what, can you explain what that report is that you're
The report that
looking
we're
for?
verifying would be a report that the Harris system has that identifies who made inputs into the system. So as we were talking about in our recommendations about having checks and balances, so when somebody changes the system or makes an input, then there is, which is not currently there, then a manager or another person would approve that change, and then there'd be printouts. But there is currently a report in the system that says this person made this change.
Okay.
Okay, and that is missing for some of your periods.
So can you confirm how far back from today you could go? When is the period that's missing?
I think it was March 2019.
We can go back to March of 2019.
Okay, so you can go back, when the information that you're looking for on who made the changes on the accounts is not available until the month after this forensic audit period ends?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Let me check and make sure everyone else has an opportunity. Is there anyone else at the dais? I'll let you have a follow-up, then let's get to the public.
I just wanted to clarify, because we were speaking of this earlier today, so the period that is missing of the user log is April 2016
Correct.
Yes.
to March 2019. So it exists before that and it exists after that.
That's our understanding.
Okay.
And I'll have more information after we talk to you about it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Well, I'll turn it over to the public. We have, 45, 50 minutes. So we have plenty of time for public comments. Is there anyone wishing to speak? Go ahead. Yeah, we'll just, if you don't mind coming up to the podium and then we can just hear you if that's okay. Sure. Thank you.
Linda Paquette, outside city limits. It's a long road here. But I'm glad we went down this road because for those of you who have not been following all along, Councilmember Casagrande is really the driving force behind this. And I can remember when she first started to point out that there were these inconsistencies. And so I just want to say on behalf of all of the people that have been watching this many-year process, that it does feel like money well spent. And it also feels like the Lady of Justice with the blindfolds maybe now is going to show up, but has not been here in terms of some of this stuff for a few years. So it sounds really good. If you can implement some of these recommendations. I'll speak to that demand meter issue. So I'm one of the people that raised the question because our house got a demand meter right during the time where we were digging into this, where we were starting to dig into this conversation, and all of a sudden I get a demand meter put on my house. So whether or not that was just a mistake or whatever, you know, there's been a lot of things like that that have happened to citizens that are your utility customers that I think the citizens are deserving of kind of cleaning up and getting things with the recommendations. And maybe there's some infrastructure money that could pay for the meters. I don't know, you know, but thank you, everybody, for doing this and for seeing it all the way through. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else wishing to speak? You have plenty of time.
Skip Ryerson, Inside the City Limits. Thanks for coming up, and thanks for the engagement and the services. Linda, you asked who watches this. I watch this. Been watching this for 20 or 30 years, and with much interest. Maybe not to this level of detail that we're at today, but I do watch the services. Been here since '74, and taken an interest, special interest in the committee and what goes on within our community. It's a complicated system, no doubt. We've heard that. I think our town, to our credit, is a complicated town. We probably have one of the more sophisticated small communities of this size in the state. And I think people don't realize that, even people live in the town. You folks probably have a good flavor for that now in the positions that you hold within our city. But it's worth reminding the public how sophisticated this is. It sounds today that, you know, when you break this down, Rob's new in the electric utility. It doesn't sound like there's really much that's taken place or transpired in the electrical department over the last 10 years, but there has. I mean, there's obviously some meter things. It's complex. We're changing meters out. We're changing processes out. And just in his utility alone, I can't help but wonder, where does the ball start, you know, in this process that we're talking about here today? Does it start when you put a line into a residence or into a business? What happens when Seward-Fish or JAG adds another motor to their system? Are they supposed to come to us and ask us for an inspection on their electrical? I don't know how that works. Obviously, after tonight, I think there'll be a lot of that discussion going on with the administration, and we'll refine some of those processes. But those things come to mind. So electrical, I think you're pretty well defined, and you probably have your marching orders, and it's pretty easy for you to start hitting the targets. The water and wastewater is obviously a more complex situation. But when you break it down, and we talk about ERUs, at least for me, and I'm surely not as educated as a lot of folks here today about this matter, but residential seems pretty straightforward. So the discussion of putting meters on residential right now, I'm scratching my head. But non-residential, I've been advocating and on board with that for quite a long time, and I think some of you have as well. I think it just seems to be a very common sense business solution. Stick the meters on. Now, Doug may not appreciate that recommendation. You know, he's got a lot of work to do, okay? It's complex. But if we got smart meters for electric that are going on, there sure the hell better be some smart water meters out there in the world that we can put in. And yet I hear, well, where are we going to come up with money, infrastructure money? You know, we need to pay our own way, you know. looking for the free handout isn't always going to work. If I'm not mistaken, I think our fine community may have been blessed with another $1 million of sales tax in 2021 over our budget. 250 of that goes to the hospital fund. There's 750. If I'm wrong, maybe it's 500, whatever. But that'll go a long way to paying for meters if we want to solve this problem. We can either solve this as quickly as possible, or we can keep coming back and spending $325,000 a whack to maybe know the things that we do know. And we have people here. We've got a lot of great people here. Utility billing, finance staff, Doug's staff, electrical, admin. They can fix it. But I said earlier, it's a complicated town. We've got a lot of moving parts. So they got a load to carry. We got them spread out pretty thin all over town on a lot of projects. But I don't know where this one raises up in the level of priorities, but I would think it probably moved up after today to maybe in the top 5. When I say complex, I just think we talked about electric, I think about water, I'm thinking about the hospital. How do you go? I read your findings in the report, and I will be very interested to see the follow-up, and I was hoping to come today with a follow-up to all of the findings that they had found. Because when I read the initial report, I read about a church. I read about the schools. There's a hospital. There's a nursing home. There are Seward Fish. There's Shoreside Petroleum with fire protection. These are all kind of complex type of businesses. And, whose responsibility is that to go out and figure all that out? But it's just complicated. So when I look at, I'll be interested to find out what's going to happen to these findings. Because when I thought about the church, for instance, I was mystified. I go, who the heck's job is that? Is that Doug's job? Is that his staff's job to figure that out? Is it one of the finance folks? Is it the finance director? Is it the assistant city manager? I couldn't tell you whose job that is. But somewhere, somebody's got to make a decision or a recommendation that we think this should be this. And yet, I've been in finance all my life. And so when problems come to me, and you got to make a recommendation or a decision to solve a question, I would think, okay, if I'm sitting somewhere in this process, okay, that building there was a residence today, it got sold, and that person's running a 4-room lodge. All of a sudden, more bathrooms in play, more water in play. Who's supposed to make those calls on what kind of ERUs are going on there? So when I said earlier, meters on all non-residences, maybe that's a good start. And I wouldn't recommend breaking out the bills in 2 bills. I really can't. You double the staff work, and then for me, I got to write 2 checks. Okay? So now I'm paying 2 bills. But I don't want to handle that much paper for. So I would say don't do the split bill until you get all the non-residential meters kicked in, and then step back, have management reassess the situation, and then maybe go from there. So, hey, thank you for your time. It's been a long process. We're on, about a year now since we started this? And I guess in closing, I wanted to ask a question, because I was confused a little bit. What is a forensic audit? Maybe folks at home don't know that this is being recorded. It's a forensic audit examines and evaluates a firm's individual financial records or to derive evidence used in the court of law or legal proceedings. Forensic auditing is a specialization within accounting. Most large firms have a forensic audit division. Forensic audits cover a wide range of investigatory activities. A forensic audit is often conducted, and this is where I was confused, to prosecute a party for fraud, embezzlement, or other financial crimes. So you know, I've been thinking about this since the conversation got started, and I thought maybe over a year ago, there was some rumblings about, there was some not so good or smart accounting processes going on in our city, and I was hearing something about fraud or legal problems. But then I read the city managers, so I was curious as to why forensic auditors were brought in. That question's always been nagging me. And then I read the city manager's report cover sheet to council on June 14th. Over the last few years, there have been discussions within the public and the council about potential issues and errors in the city's utility buildings. As a result, city council directed administration to an RFP for a forensic audit to examine and investigate. So I'm a little confused, you know. The city manager's write-up, and she's online, to me speaks more to, and this is more of a discussion for the future, because we may get into this again. The city manager's write-up kind of gave me the impression that maybe we just need our auditing firm, BDO or somebody, to bring on a team and do a general audit of our utility systems. But to bring a forensic audit team in, that's a whole other ballgame. And it has significant meaning to it. These folks go to court, they bring evidence to courtrooms to prosecute people for crimes. So I wanted to clarify this because I wanted to take this cloud off of all of our city employees and lift that load of any concerns that they were doing something wrong. And I hope at the end of all this, that this is resolved and, you know, in a positive way, so we can get back to doing other positive things within our city. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else wishing to make comments?
Tony Bachman, Inside City Limits. I want to thank everybody, first of all, for continuing this work. The previous councilman, Cheryl's here tonight, and I'm here to see this process through. This is something we both voted on and believed in. I think that was very important that this process happened. And unfortunately, maybe Mr. Ryerson missed the meeting when we tried to hire a firm, an accounting firm, to do this audit, and we had to go out twice. Because the first time, the scope of the work could not be completed by the audit firm, and we didn't have the right definitions. So even when we went out the second time, BDO did not bid on this project because it was out of their scope to do. So the difference between the forensic audit and the regular audit was we were not looking as deep into all the information as we are now, which we found out more information that was from the regular audit, which for many, many times that we went through audits and listened to how those audits are not really guided to look for any wrongdoings other than minor miscalculations of balancing a checkbook. And as many conversations as I had with Altman and Rogers about accounting and questions that we had in accounting, this was very important, I feel, to have this because we needed a deeper dive in that. I want to thank the people who asked really hard questions tonight about specific periods of time. It's not easy to stand up in front of a lot of people and ask hard questions, and it's not easy to be in this community and ask the hard questions and face the public all the time too. So I want to thank all the council for you know, what they've done and keeping this going. I hope, you know, I agree with Mr. Ryerson that we shouldn't have a cloud over everyone, and hopefully that will lift this cloud and we can get down to moving forward and getting all the recommendations in place and moving forward from now on. I think these are amazing things that we can look at to get everything equal and everybody understand what their billing is. Work is hard, and hard work pays off, and separating that billing would do an amazing thing, because people have been so confused for so long on what their bill actually is for electric, right? Because you're looking at your power and you're looking at your water and you're saying, this is how much I pay for my electric bill. You hear that all the time, I pay so much for my electric bill. But you're not understanding, you're also paying your water bill and your electric bill, and people are comparing their bills with other people from across the peninsula, and they're confused, they don't know what is happening. So separating those two would make a lot of sense. It's a recommendation from the auditors, and I think we all know that when we talk about when people come to talk about bills to you as a council member, you always have to remind them that there's two bills that you pay in there, your water bill and your electric bill, and to make sure you separate those two and really look at what you are paying for your power and compare those like apples and apples. So I want to thank you so much again for moving forward with this, and I'm glad that we were able to get all of this to culminate into this meeting today, and it's really nice to see this done. So thank you.
Is there anyone else wishing to speak? Anyone else wishing to speak? Go ahead.
My name's Susie Towsley. I live inside city limits. I'm a former city council member from November of 2019 November 2017 to October 2019. I recently had my second go-around with COVID. I'm good by Providence and my primary care provider to be in public, but I hope you'll forgive me for being a little bit overly cautious just as I get back out in public and speak before you tonight with the mask on my face. I will try to enunciate. I also look forward to the findings of this forensic audit, and I look forward to any accountability that council can bring forward for how our city hall works, how all of our utility billing works. It is a public organization after all, and I've always wanted for there to be a very clear transparency for how it works and a good understanding for the public to make a better relationship between City Hall and the public. I think that relationship by and large has improved dramatically over the last couple of years in my opinion. These recommendations all look great. I love that you have a professional outfit in here with fresh eyes, making recommendations like making sure that people do go on vacation so that you do have checks and balances built in to the system in the way that it works so that it's not, so that you're confident that it's not exposing the city to any liability or being unfairly, inequitably used in any way whatsoever. I look forward to seeing what comes of it. I want to thank especially Councilmember Casagranda for being the most tenacious person I know probably with this. And then some of you have been sitting here for a long time. And I appreciate the work that you do, all of you. And I would put out a specific call to those of you that have been here for a long time and maybe have been aware of issues to really look at these findings with as clear of eyes as you can muster. Issues like not having that report between April of 2016 to March of 2019 is deeply troubling for me. I agree that we need to be able to move forward with confidence in our public system. I appreciate you guys being on here and doing this work. I used to use a little euphemism that I felt like when I was on that side of the dais, I was often eating a poop sandwich that I had not ordered, and I feel like you guys are all at the buffet now, and you didn't necessarily weren't here when these decisions were being made 5 years ago, when whatever was going on that we're finally uncovering was going on, but you're here now, and I appreciate your work trying to make this as equitable as possible so that people know that they can come to City Hall when they have issues, and they don't have to be worried about being charged different rates or, you know, just facing an inequitable system that doesn't have any accountability or doesn't seem to have transparency. That's not what we want at City Hall. So I look forward to this moving forward. I'm going to be following along closely. If I'm not in the audience, I'll be at home following along, and you'll probably hear more from me. With regard to what the purpose of a forensic audit is, I remember those meetings and was following along at home when the previous council was making the decision to enter into this agreement to go out for forensic audit. And it was discussed in this forum, and it was discussed in public, and it was thoroughly discussed. And I appreciate that. And let's not stop now. We're getting to some truth of the matter that we really need to peel back and to see it. So again, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing what's coming next.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak? Yeah, I mean, we can go through a second round if people have further comments. We still have time. You could.
head outside city limits, just to speak to the, why a forensic audit. It comes back to Lady Justice with the blindfolds, right? What seemed to be happening was certain people were getting special rates, other people were paying more. And now we have the actual paperwork that shows exactly that. So that's why a regular forensic auditor would not be looking at that level. And so I just wanted to review that because this was really driven by Councilmember Casagranda, but on behalf of citizens that were upset about the bills they were getting and could see inconsistencies between their bills and other people's bills with similar properties. So I think it had to be a forensic auditor, and I'm glad that you finally did it, and I'm glad that we can move forward now. And I would agree that splitting the billing out, given the history of where we've been through, what we've been through, yes, it's going to raise some costs, but I think you can offset them in some other ways. I think it would be very beneficial. I've lived in other cities where you don't get your water and your sewer and you get 3 different bills, you know, not to count your cable and all of those other utilities. But, you know, utilities billing, there are tariffs, there's reasons why they're established, and when you get a bill, it needs to fit in within the tariffs that have been approved. And when you've got bills that are outside of that, then there's something obviously not working right. So I'm really happy you did this, and I think the citizens are going to be really appreciative. Thank you.
Is there anyone else that would like to make a second comment or would like to make a first comment? Anyone else? So if there's any other comments from the dais before we come out?
I'd just like to know when the auditors get the report back from Harris, can that be distributed as a laydown, or how will that be distributed to us as an email or?
So if that's the only question, here's what I was gonna just propose before we come out of this committee of the whole. When we come back on formal record, I was just gonna, for the record, make these 3 statements coming out of this, and let's see if it matches. I was gonna ask that follow-up to the questions to the contractor be routed through administration and distributed to council. The second thing I said, wrote down was any ongoing reports and updates on follow-up from the recommendations and findings will be provided to council, and, you know, per some of the city manager comments already done tonight. And then the third thing was continue reports to council regarding the internal audit being conducted by administration. So really no specific recommendations moving forward, other than I think this is not the start of the process, but the middle of a process where, you know, based on these recommendations, it sounds like administration is going to be working with our current CPA firm to put more checks and balances in place. So once we come out, that was a long-winded, that's what I was just going to say on more of the regular part of the meeting. Is there anything that I'm missing or anything that needs to be added? Is there further discussion, and then we can come out of this committee of the whole? Okay. So without objection, we'll come out of the committee of the whole. I'm going to re-verbalize the report coming out of committee with 3 actionable items. There's administration will, there will be follow-up from the questions to the contractor, and those will be submitted to administration and then distributed to council. There'll be ongoing reports and updates regarding the follow-up from the recommendations and findings. And I just also want to state, you know, the city manager has made some comments and has provided some direction during this evening's review of the recommendations. And finally, the third thing would be, administration will continue, or will provide reports to council on the internal audit currently being conducted by administration. So I don't believe that, stating that on the record, I don't believe we need a second in any sort of motion, but just if there's any objections to council. City manager, do you have any objections to that, or anything that needs to be changed?
No, Madam Mayor, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. So now that we're out of the committee of the whole, now is another opportunity to provide citizen comments, and that, again, will be 3 minutes. You know, it's a little confusing. Oh, excuse me, 5 minutes. It's not listed on the, it's a little confusing because during the work session portion, it's not as formal, so we can kind of respond or follow up, and now there's another 5-minute opportunity for comments if anyone has comments. Again, you're welcome to stand up and make comments for 5 minutes. The good news is we're trying to ensure that the public gets plenty of opportunities to speak. Next is, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
It's all right, I lingered for a second. Susie Towsey, still live inside city limits. 2 quick things. I want to say how much I appreciate that I feel like I can call the city manager's office and get a call back, and that there is an open door policy, and that I feel like we have competent, good managers at this point, and what a huge difference that makes the atmosphere in City Hall, and that how much I appreciate that professionalism that I feel and see coming from City Hall, and from council as well. I feel like we often are told, or I feel like I was often told when I was on council, and then still sometimes told, that the city of Seward is this very complex thing, very sophisticated, and it probably is on some levels, but we are not some special rare gem where all the rules that exist in the rest of the planet with cities our size would not work here. And I know that we are competent people on city council, we have competent, professional management. It is within your ability as a council, I believe, and management's ability to handle this and also handle the daily goings and doings of the city in a professional manner, even as sophisticated and unique as Seward is, in my opinion. And thank you again for the work that you do.
Is there anyone else wishing to speak?
Cheryl Cease, City Limits, prior council member. I just want to say I am thrilled that we are finally having at least part of the forensic audit that we wanted. And I think things will change in our billing system. So hopefully we continue. I appreciate everybody for everything that you've done. I followed you while I was gone, so I kind of know what's been going on. But it's good to be back. But I want to thank everybody and the auditors, the forensic audit gentlemen, for helping us. And I'll be back. Not on council. To speak now up here, okay? Yes, I do know.
Is there anyone else wishing to speak? Okay, hearing and seeing none, we're now to council and administration comments. We'll start with administration. Any comments? Any comments, Jeanette?
I do have a comment, Madam Mayor.
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to respond. I have heard it stated multiple times that the city is complicated, and I would agree that the city is complicated, but council, if you remember, one of my goals is to demystify the utilities so they're not as complicated for us internally and for the public. So it truly is a goal, because I think that, it needs to be done, and then the residents can understand the billing processes and the utility processes, and I think as we simplify them and peel them back, we can also easily recognize that there's an error. So that's one of my goals, is to demystify the utilities.
Thank you. Council, I'll start with Councilmember Wells.
No comments.
Thank you. Councilmember Calhoun?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to everybody that came in and paid attention to this. Some of us are a little bit newer to this. I think it's probably a good thing that you guys have done to get this. One of the goals that I've always had is for the community to regain the trust in the people that work inside this building, because for a while it hasn't been there. This is probably a step in that direction to help simplify some things. I have some other comments that we'll get into when we actually decide how we're going to go forward with this when we get more information back. I do know that citizens also need to be involved in this, because things don't always change just because a home or a business changes. So people out there also need to take the initiative to come in and talk to the utility office or whatever if there's a change in their status, because I've done that, and it does work. So don't be afraid to come in and talk to these folks. They don't bite, and most of them that I know are pretty good folks. So I think we're moving in a good direction. It is a complicated little city. I've always thought it was a town of 3,000 people acting like a town of 30,000 people, because we have so much going on, so many different industries. This may help to simplify some of the issues a little bit.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Casagrande?
I'll just echo everything that Councilmember Calhoun said. So thank you.
Great, Councilmember DeMoss?
Yeah, I just want to thank the presenters tonight, the forensic auditors, for being so available to answer our questions. At first, I was a little disappointed that this is what the audit was, because I knew what a forensic audit was. I Googled it when I asked for it, and I asked for it for a reason, because I trusted Councilmember Casagrande and was notified of multiple errors. And for me, it's not only important to identify what the errors are and correct them, but it's important to find out why they happened. Regardless, if we all want to stay positive and move forward, and it's easier to sweep things under the rug, especially because we have this great new administration and these smart people and these great recommendations, but it will only happen again if we don't find out why it happened. And it's extremely bothersome to me to know that there's a report that is missing that is supposed to be part of this forensic audit, and in my opinion, didn't allow the auditors to complete the job that we are asking for. So I look forward to getting that report, finding out why we didn't get it in the first place, and then working as a body to figure out how we want to move forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Osenga?
Thank you to the presenters and administration for this meeting. It's pretty, a lot of good information came out of it. And I'm looking forward to things moving forward.
Vice Mayor?
Echoing what everyone said, it was good to see the faces out there and former council members. It's like old times here. Yeah, I'm a little disappointed too that we don't have a complete complete report. So when the report that you're going to give us comes in, that'll be useful, and then we can figure out how to move on, because I also like to, find out what happened in the missing times and why these things happen. So I agree with Council Member DeMoss that we need to continue to look into what's actually happening, but we need to move on too. So it's going to be a balancing act, I think.
Thank you. And I've made some earlier comments, so I just want to say thank you to Green for coming up here. I think it was useful to have you guys in person and all the work, and then also thank city employees, because I know there's been a lot of behind the scenes gathering data, getting information to these folks. So I'll just end on those thanks. And with that, we will adjourn at 6:40.